I've been interested in the inclusion of young children with disabilities in general early care and education settings for a number of years. And a lot of the practices that I've been part of, either in helping to create or to research or to provide training and implementation, have generally looked at what we do when a child with a disability is placed in child care or a preschool setting, and what are the services we need to integrate along with the child and family into those settings. But in the last couple of years, we've started to rethink that. And with the notion of universal design, it begins to introduce a whole different way of looking at how we include children with disabilities in general early care and education settings. Universal design came from the field of architecture, and it's been around as a concept for a number of years in the field of architecture. And it came out of designing physical spaces and including in that design considerations for people with physical disabilities and designing spaces that would enable citizens of a variety of ability levels access to buildings, to public spaces. And in that school, they had seen through the Americans with Disabilities Act the need to retrofit buildings and public spaces to enable all American citizens to have access to settings. And they realized that, retrofitting is a very expensive process. What would happen if we did it right from the start? And so this notion of universal design was born with the idea that when we create new buildings and public spaces, that let's do it right from the beginning. Let's take into consideration the fact that this is a public space, whether it's your local department store, a park, or crossing the street downtown. Let's take into account right from the beginning all the different folks that are going to use these spaces, and let's plan it right. And from that, they developed a number of principles that guide architects in designing buildings and spaces. And the idea was, let's simplify spaces and buildings so that most of the time, most people can access and use them. Well, that's a very intriguing idea, and one that folks have begun to apply in education. There have been folks that have been applying it in the area of assistive technology in the education and using technology and computers in the education of elementary and secondary age kids. Because if you write the program well enough, it can take into account a variety of learners that are in front of them in terms of their interests and their ability levels. It can accommodate on the fly. Well, in early education, which is my arena, looking at the education of preschool age kids, we begin to ask the question, well, what does universal design look like in early education? And how does that impact young children with special needs or disabilities, and how does that impact the role of early childhood special educators? Because I'm a special educator. I was trained to provide and design and provide special ed services to children, and whenever possible, to do that within early care and education, general early care and education settings. So we started to apply the principles that the architects gave us and ask questions about how well do these principles apply to the design of general early care and education. Because in a lot of ways, it isn't talking about the design of special education and special services. The twist, and this is really an important twist when we think about inclusion from a traditional sense, it's not so much what we do around an individual child. Now we're really looking at the whole child care or preschool setting and saying, how do we make this setting, this physical setting, the social life, the curriculum, how do we redesign it in a way that it makes it, that it works for most of the kids most of the time? Recognizing that there are going to be children that at times are going to need additional, specialized, intensive, individualized services. But what can we do to the general preschool setting so that it's successful most of the time for most of the children? And so some of the work that we've done have been in applying those principles, and we've started to play with those principles. We've also played with the principles that have been put out by CAST, Center on Assistive Special Technology or Systems Technology, and say, how does this apply to early education? And so the principles that we've come up with are close to both of them. We've kind of adapted and used both the North Carolina University's principles as well as CAST principles to identify, well, what does it mean to universally design preschool settings? Now, those principles include, one, creating accessible environments. That's an easy one. You know, we can easily look at a physical classroom and say, is this accessible? Are there barriers? Can most children access all parts of the room, access the materials on the shelves, and be able to engage wherever the activities are? Is it physically accessible, and is it socially accessible? And that's an important one, because you know, when we look at and talk about social accessibility and equitability, now we're also talking about, is that child, are all children welcome members of that early childhood education community? And so this notion of to quote a book by an early childhood author, you can't say you can't play. That's not something that can happen in an early education classroom. All children can be encouraged and it's accessible. Another principle that we identified is the importance, and we borrowed this from CAST, of looking at common curriculum. And rather than having you know, a curriculum for Johnny with Down syndrome, or a curriculum for Juanita, whose English is a second language, and another curriculum for children who are in poverty and served through Title I, we need to look at a common curriculum, which means we need to look at a curriculum that can meet the needs of most children most of the time. And within that curriculum, be able to establish goals during activities and lesson plans that meet the broad needs of children that belong in the classroom. Because the reality is, even though children with disabilities may have been an impetus, the reality is in our classrooms and in our preschools, the population is quite diverse. So it's not just children with disabilities that might present challenges. It's English language learners, it's children who come from homes that may not have had a number of experiences. So we need to look at a common curriculum, because we don't want to be segregating or stigmatizing anybody with a separate curriculum. Then in the delivery of that curriculum, we need to look at flexibility. Flexibility in how we provide instruction, how we deliver the information, as well as the kind of responses that we expect of children. We need to be able to get outside the box at a one-size-fits-all, and so that when we do a lesson plan, whether it's at circle time, you know, we're providing the direction, providing the information. We may do that verbally, but we're also using signs. Maybe we have pictures for the visual learner. Maybe we're saying it once and then we're saying it again using simpler language. But it's all done in the same lesson for everybody at the same time. No one's being pulled out. We're not having to provide individual tutors or paraprofessional aids to any one child. It's redesigning what you do as the teacher so that you're reaching, again, as many kids at the same time as possible. So through these principles of universal design, our hope is that we can get away from older traditional models of inclusion, where sometimes we still maintain these dual parallel systems of services. There's the general early education system and there's the special education system. And we start to look really at the general early education system being the main person, the main educational focus in that child's life, and then special ed for those few instances and those few kids when there are additional, more intensive services needed, they can come in and provide those. But it's again done within this common, equitable, universally designed early education setting.
Thank you very much.
You're
Good
welcome.
work.
Good.